You're not missing the shot. You're missing the wind you can't see. The voice came low and steady, almost lost beneath the restless hum of the firing range, but it cut through the tension like a blade drawn slow and deliberate. Captain Ryan Vickers didn't turn at first. His jaw was locked tight, eyes fixed downrange at the distant steel silhouette sitting at exactly 1,732 yards, a speck of dull gray barely visible through the heat shimmer rising off the desert floor. 3 shots left. That was all they had before the qualification window closed. Around him, the best Marine snipers in his unit lay prone behind rifles worth more than most cars in the parking lot, their scopes dialed, their ballistic computers synced, their data flawless. And yet, the target remained untouched. The last shot cracked through the air seconds earlier, clean, controlled, textbook execution, and still a miss. Not wide, not sloppy, just wrong. Vickers exhaled sharply, the sound tight with frustration. Wind call, he snapped. We had a perfect wind call. The spotter beside the shooter adjusted his headset, confusion creeping into his voice. We did, sir. Left to right, 3 miles per hour, steady. No shift. But even as he said it, the range flags told a different story. They fluttered lazily, inconsistent, like they couldn't agree with each other. One angled left. Another sagged straight down. The farthest one flicked right for half a second before going still again. It didn't make sense. None of it did. Vickers felt the pressure building behind his ribs, tight and unforgiving. This wasn't just another training day. This was pre-deployment qualification. Fail here, and the entire team got flagged. Delayed. Reassigned. Months of preparation erased by a problem no one could explain. He turned now, finally, irritation boiling over, ready to shut down whatever distraction had spoken. And that's when he saw him. The old man stood just beyond the firing line, a push broom resting loosely in his hand, its worn bristles dragging faint lines through the dust. He looked completely out of place. Faded work shirt, sun-bleached jeans, boots that had seen more years than most of the Marines on the line. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but his eyes weren't. Pale blue, steady, locked onto the distant target like everything else around him was just noise. Vickers frowned. This is a restricted range, he said sharply. You're not supposed to be here. The old man didn't flinch, didn't apologize. He just shifted his gaze slightly, not toward Vickers, but toward the empty air between the rifles and the target, as if he were watching something invisible move through it. You're chasing the wrong wind, he said quietly. A few of the Marines exchanged glances, subtle smirks forming. One of them let out a short breath of amusement. Vickers took a step forward, his authority snapping into place. We've got real-time data, calibrated instruments, and trained spotters, he replied, voice edged with controlled irritation. We're not guessing out here. The old man nodded once, almost to himself. I can see that. The words weren't mocking. That somehow made them worse. Another shot was chambered. The metallic click echoed in the dry air. Vickers turned back toward the line, forcing focus, forcing control. Send it, he ordered. The rifle fired. The recoil settled. All eyes locked onto the target. A pause. Then the spotter's voice, quieter now. Mississippi, no one spoke after that. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Somewhere behind them, the soft scrape of the broom resumed, slow and rhythmic against the ground. The old man moved a few steps, then stopped again, head tilting slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The wind brushed across the range, subtle, shifting, impossible to pin down. And for the first time that day, Corporal Liam Carter felt it. Not on his face, not on the flags, but in the space between moments, in the way the air seemed to hesitate before settling. He glanced back at the old man, unease tightening in his chest. Because the way he was looking at that target, it wasn't curiosity. It wasn't guesswork. It was recognition. The next round did not begin with a command, but with a hesitation, a subtle fracture in the rhythm of confidence that had defined the morning, and Captain Ryan Vickers felt it immediately, the way a seasoned officer senses when control is slipping before anyone else dares to admit it, because the numbers still said everything was correct, the devices still glowed with clean data, and yet the air itself refused to cooperate, shifting in ways no algorithm seemed to catch. And behind him, the faint scrape of the broom stopped again, as if even that quiet, steady motion had chosen. to wait, to observe, to listen, and Vickers forced his focus back onto the shooter lying prone on the line. A staff sergeant with years of experience, a man who had never failed a qualification at this distance. And yet now his breathing had changed, shallow, uncertain, his confidence no longer anchored in certainty, but drifting in the same invisible currents that carried the bullet off course. Just 2 clicks right, the spotter said, voice lower now, stripped of earlier certainty. Wind is shifting, but the words sounded like an apology rather than a solution, and Vickers stepped closer, boots crunching against the dry gravel, the sound sharp in the otherwise controlled silence. No guessing, he said, firm, controlled, forcing discipline back into the moment. We trust the data. And the shooter nodded, small, tight, chambering another round with deliberate care, the metallic sound echoing again. And for a brief second, everything aligned, posture, breath, trigger control, the kind of textbook execution that should have ended the problem right there. The shot broke clean, a sharp crack that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, and every eye tracked the invisible arc toward the target. And again, that pause, that fraction of time where expectation held its breath, before the quiet voice of the spotter returned, softer now, almost disbelieving, miss, just off left edge. And this time no one reacted, no frustration, no immediate correction, just silence, because the pattern was no longer random. It was consistent in its failure, precise in its inaccuracy, and that was worse, far worse, because it meant something fundamental was being misunderstood, and Vickers felt it settle in his chest, heavy and unwelcome. The realization that control was no longer absolute, that something on this range was operating outside the parameters he trusted, and behind him, that same low voice spoke again, not louder, not forceful, but impossible to ignore. Now that everything else had failed, you are reading where the wind is, the old man said, his tone even, patient, not where it is going. And Vickers closed his eyes for half a second, a brief internal check against the rising irritation, before turning slowly, measured, his authority still intact but strained at the edges. And you think you can see that? He asked, not mocking, not yet, but testing. And the old man met his gaze without hesitation, without challenge, just a quiet certainty that did not need to raise its voice. No, he said, I listened for it. And the words lingered, strange and unfamiliar in a space dominated by numbers and calculations, and somewhere to the side, Corporal Liam Carter shifted his weight, his eyes moving not to the screens or the flags, but to the space between them, the same space the old man had been watching since the beginning. And for the first time, Carter noticed something he had missed. Before, not a movement, not a visible change, but a pattern in the heat rising off the ground, a distortion that did not flow in one direction but split, subtle layers moving against each other like overlapping currents in water, and it sent a quiet ripple of unease through him, because it matched what the old man had said, not one wind, but something more complex, something their tools had flattened into simplicity. And Vickers saw the hesitation spreading, felt it in the stillness of his team, and knew he had seconds to restore control before doubt took root. Reset positions, he ordered, voice sharper now, reclaiming command. We are not done. But even as the Marines adjusted, even as discipline reasserted itself on the surface, the range no longer felt the same, the air heavier, the silence deeper, as if something unseen had stepped into the space between them and was waiting for its turn to speak. Captain Ryan Vickers did not raise his voice again, and that alone was enough to pull every Marine on the line back into position, because silence from a man like him carried more weight than any command, and the range responded in kind, settling into a stillness that felt deliberate, controlled, almost forced, as if everyone present understood that whatever came next would decide more than just a qualification score. And Vickers folded his arms slowly, eyes narrowing toward the distant target, recalibrating not the data, but the situation itself, because the problem was no longer just technical. It had become something else, something intangible, and he did not like variables he could not define. Explain it, he said finally, not turning this time, his voice level, measured, directed not at his team, but at the presence behind him, and for a moment, there was no answer. Only the faint whisper of wind brushing across. The range, uneven, inconsistent, carrying dust in small drifting lines that broke apart before they could form a pattern. And then the old man stepped forward, not onto the firing line, not crossing any boundary, just close enough that his voice no longer had to travel. "You are solving for a straight path," he said, his eyes still fixed downrange. "But the air is not straight today." And a few of the Marines shifted slightly, not out of disrespect, but because the words landed in a place there. Training did not fully cover, and Vickers turned his head just enough to study him. Really study him this time. Not as a distraction, not as a civilian out of place, but as a variable that had yet to be understood. "Air is never straight," Vickers replied, calm, controlled, but with an edge of challenge now sharpened by necessity, and the old man nodded once, acknowledging the truth without conceding the point. "Correct," he said, "but today it is layered," and that word lingered, heavier than the others, because it implied depth, complexity, something beyond the surface readings their instruments were designed to capture. And Corporal Liam Carter felt it again, that quiet shift in perception, as his gaze moved back to the heat rising off the ground. No longer random distortion, but something structured, something with direction, multiple directions, overlapping in ways that canceled each other out at a glance, but created subtle deviations over distance. And he swallowed, his throat suddenly dry, because he could see it now, not clearly, not perfectly, but enough to know it was there, and that they had been ignoring it all morning. "We account for crosswinds," Vickers said, more to reassert the framework than to dismiss the observation. "We adjust for drift, for temperature, for elevation." And the old man finally looked at him fully, his pale blue eyes steady, not confrontational, just certain. "You account for what your tools can measure," he said quietly, "not for what they cannot." And the words settled into the silence like a weight, and no one laughed this time. No one smirked, because every miss on that target had already proven that something was being missed in return, and Vickers felt the shift, subtle but undeniable. The moment when authority alone was no longer enough to carry the situation forward, when results had to speak instead, and he exhaled slowly, making a decision that balanced on the edge of risk and control. "You have something to add," he said, turning now, fully facing the old man. "Then say it clearly." And for the first time, the old man glanced toward the rifle on the line, the modern weapon resting steady on its bipod, precision engineered, perfectly maintained, and then beyond it, to the target, to the space in between, as if mapping something invisible in his mind. "Your bullet is entering one wind," he said, voice calm, deliberate, then leaving it halfway, crossing into another that pushes it back, and then a third that drops it just enough to miss. And Carter felt a chill run through him, because it matched exactly what they were seeing without being able to explain, a consistent miss that made no sense under a single set of conditions. And Vickers held his gaze, searching for hesitation, for doubt, for any sign that this was guesswork dressed as confidence. But there was none, only that same quiet certainty that had been there from the beginning. And behind them, the range flags shifted again, each one telling a different story, none of them complete on their own. And for the first time that morning, Vickers did not look at the data screen. He looked at the air itself, and what he saw there was not clarity, but complexity, and that was enough to change everything. The range did not move, but something in it shifted, subtle and irreversible, like a line drawn in dust that no one could erase once it had been seen. And Captain Ryan Vickers felt the weight of that shift settle into his posture, into the way his shoulders squared, not out of confidence, but out of decision. Because this was no longer about proving his team was right. It was about understanding why they were not. And that distinction mattered more than rank in moments like this. "Show me," he said, the words controlled, deliberate, not an order but not a request either. And the old man did not answer immediately. He simply looked down the range again, eyes tracing that invisible corridor between rifle and target, as if confirming something only he could see, before stepping forward another pace, still careful, still respectful of the boundary that separated observer from participant. "He needs to hold," the old man said, nodding toward the shooter. "Not where your data says, but where the air will carry it." And Vickers gestured once, sharp and efficient, granting space without surrendering command. "Do it," he said, and the Marines on the line adjusted instinctively, not because they fully trusted what they were hearing, but because every other option had already failed, and that was enough. The shooter settled back into position, breath slowing, body aligning with the rifle as if resetting everything from the ground up, and Corporal Liam Carter found himself watching the old man instead of the scope, because whatever was about to happen would not come from the screen, it would come from him. "Look at the mirage," the old man said quietly, and Carter followed his gaze, really followed it this time, not just glancing but studying, and the heat waves rising from the earth no longer looked like distortion, but like motion, layered, shifting in directions that contradicted each other. One stream drifting left, another cutting across it, a third barely visible but present in the way the air seemed to hesitate before settling. "That is your first wind," the old man continued, voice steady. "It will take the bullet early." And the shooter made a minute adjustment, barely perceptible, and Vickers watched closely, committing every movement to memory, because if this worked, it would change more than just this shot. "Halfway down range," the old man said. "It crosses into a second current, weaker, but opposite, it will push back." And Carter felt his pulse quicken, because he could see it now, not clearly, not perfectly, but enough to understand that they had been reading the surface while ignoring the depth, and the shooter adjusted again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if trusting something he could not fully explain. And just before impact, the old man finished. "There is a drop, not gravity, not your usual drift, just a pocket of still air that will let it fall." And the range fell completely silent. No movement, no whisper, just the faint sound of wind brushing across sand and steel. And Vickers did not speak, did not interfere, because this moment no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the outcome. The shooter inhaled, exhaled, and held, the rifle steady, the world narrowing to a single line that no longer followed the logic of the instruments, but something older, something quieter, and for a brief second, everything aligned, not perfectly, but intentionally, and the shot broke, clean, controlled, carried forward into a space that no longer felt predictable, and every eye followed, waiting, measuring not just the result, but the meaning behind it. And in that suspended moment, before the impact could even be confirmed, Carter realized something that made his chest tighten. This was not luck, it was not adjustment, it was understanding. And whatever happened next would prove whether that understanding belonged to the past or had just returned to the present. The sound reached them a fraction of a second later, a sharp, distant metallic ring that cut clean through the stillness. And for a brief moment no one moved, because the brain needed time to accept what the ears had already confirmed. And then the spotter's voice came, not loud, not triumphant, but stunned in a way that carried more weight than any shout. "Impact, center mass." And the words seemed to settle over the range like a physical force, pressing down on every doubt, every calculation, every assumption that had failed them just minutes before. And Captain Ryan Vickers did not react immediately, his eyes still fixed through the spotting scope, as if verifying what could no longer be denied. The target standing unchanged in the distance, but now marked by a single, precise result that had broken the pattern, and behind him, no one spoke, because there was nothing to say that would not sound smaller than what had just happened. And Corporal Liam Carter felt it in his chest, that quiet, unmistakable shift from uncertainty to realization, not excitement, not relief, but recognition, the kind that settles deep and stays there. Because this was not a lucky correction. This was something else entirely, something deliberate, something understood, and slowly, Vickers lowered the scope, his posture unchanged, but his expression altered in a way only those closest to him would notice. The sharp edge of certainty replaced by something more measured, more cautious, and he turned. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the controlled movement of a man who knew this moment would define what came next. And his eyes found the old man again, standing where he had been, broom resting lightly in his hand, as if nothing extraordinary had just taken place, as if the outcome had been expected. "All along." Again, Vickers said, the word calm but carrying a new weight now. Not a challenge, not a dismissal, but a test. And the shooter reset, slower this time, more deliberate, the confidence no longer forced but rebuilt piece by piece. And Carter watched closely, not the rifle, not the scope, but the air, following the same invisible paths the old man had described. trying to see what he had missed before, trying to learn in real time what could not be taught through screens or charts. And the old man spoke again, just enough to guide, not to control. It shifted, he said softly. The first current is weaker now. And the shooter adjusted, trusting the voice without fully understanding why. And Vickers did not interrupt, did not correct, because the result had already earned that silence. And the shot broke again, clean, controlled, carried into the same complex space that had defeated them all morning. And once more, the range held its breath. And once more, the distant sound returned. That same sharp confirmation echoing back across the distance. And this time there was no hesitation, no disbelief, just a quiet, collective understanding that something had changed, not in the equipment, not in the conditions, but in the way they were seeing the problem. And Vickers exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing just enough to allow clarity to take its place. And he stepped forward, closing the distance by a few feet, not enough to invade, but enough to acknowledge. "What is your name?" he asked. The question simple, direct, stripped of rank and formality. And the old man looked at him, not surprised, not impressed, just present. "Walter Boone," he said, and the name hung in the air for a moment, unremarkable on its own, but carried with a weight that had yet to be understood. And Carter felt it again, that quiet sense that something larger was unfolding beneath the surface. Because names like that did not appear out of nowhere, not in places like this, not in moments like this. And Vickers nodded once, committing it to memory, the same way he would any detail that mattered. And behind them, the wind shifted again, subtle, layered, alive in ways no instrument had fully captured, but no longer invisible, not anymore. The name did not echo across the range, it settled into it, quiet and unassuming. And yet it carried a weight that none of them could immediately define. And Captain Ryan Vickers felt it in the way the moment held just a fraction longer than expected, as if something unseen had acknowledged it before anyone else could. And he gave a short nod, not out of politeness, but recognition that this was no longer an interruption to his operation. This was now part of it. And he turned slightly, scanning his team, measuring not their posture but their focus. Because what had just happened could either sharpen them or unravel them depending on how it was handled next. "Reset for final sequence," he said, voice steady, controlled, reclaiming structure without dismissing what had changed. And the Marines moved with renewed precision. But there was something different now, not hesitation, not doubt, but awareness, a subtle shift in how they observed the range, how they watched the air instead of just the instruments. And Corporal Liam Carter found himself no longer glancing at the data screen at all, his eyes tracking the heat rising from the ground, following the faint distortions as they bent and twisted in overlapping paths, trying to read them the way Walter Boone seemed to, not as noise, but as information. And it was difficult, frustrating even, because the patterns refused to stay still long enough to be defined. But for the first time, he understood that they were there, and that understanding alone changed how he stood, how he breathed, how he listened to the space around him. And behind him, Boone shifted his weight slightly, the broom resting against his shoulder now, forgotten for the moment, his attention fully on the range, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that quietly held it. And Vickers noticed that too, the absence of urgency, the absence of ego, and it unsettled him more than arrogance ever could, because it meant this man was not trying to prove anything. He was simply seeing what was there. And that kind of confidence did not come from theory, it came from experience, deep, lived, and undeniable. "You learned this where?" Vickers asked, the question direct, not confrontational, but carrying the weight of command, because answers mattered now. And Boone did not respond immediately, his gaze still fixed downrange, as if the question had to pass through something else before reaching him. And when he spoke, it was not to impress, not to explain in detail, but to state something simple and complete. "A long time ago," he said, and the words could have ended there, but they did not feel incomplete. They felt intentional, as if anything more would not add to their meaning. And Carter felt a strange tension in his chest, not frustration, but curiosity sharpened by respect, because that answer carried more than it revealed. And before anyone could press further, Boone tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing just a fraction. "It is changing again," he said, voice calm but firm enough to pull every attention back to the range. And Vickers turned instantly, following his line of sight. And this time he did not look at the instruments first. He looked at the air, at the flags, at the subtle shifts that had been invisible to him before. And there it was, not clear, not obvious, but present. A change in the way the heat moved, in the way the flags hesitated, before settling. And he felt it, not as data, but as awareness. And he gave a short nod, more to himself than anyone else. Adjust, he ordered, trusting what he could not yet fully measure. And the shooter complied, slower now, more deliberate, as if each movement carried more meaning than before. And Carter watched Boone again, trying to anticipate what he would say next. But the old man did not speak. He simply observed, allowing the moment to unfold, allowing them to see if they could follow without guidance. And that silence was heavier than any instruction, because it placed the responsibility back where it belonged. And as the rifle settled once more, as breath slowed and focus narrowed, Carter realized something that made his pulse steady instead of race. This was not about being shown how to shoot. This was about learning how to see, and that was something no machine could ever do for them. The next shot did not come with tension. It came with intent, and that difference was felt across the entire range before a single trigger was touched, because something fundamental had shifted in how the Marines were approaching the problem. And Captain Ryan Vickers saw it in the way the shooter settled behind the rifle, not forcing control, not chasing perfection, but aligning with something less rigid, something responsive. And that alone told him more than any data readout could. Take your time, he said, his voice lower now, no longer driving the moment forward but allowing it to unfold. And the shooter inhaled slowly, exhaled halfway, and held, not locking into a fixed point but adjusting in real time, following the subtle movements in the air that none of them had truly seen before today. And Corporal Liam Carter watched the heat again, tracking the layered distortion as it shifted, trying to anticipate where it would move next instead of where it had been. And it was difficult, the patterns refusing to stay consistent. But he could feel it now, not just see it. The way the air carried motion like a current beneath the surface, and beside him, Walter Boone remained still, saying nothing, offering no correction, and that silence was deliberate. It forced them to rely on what they had just learned instead of leaning back on his guidance. And the rifle cracked, sharp and controlled. And this time no one leaned forward, no one strained to see the result, because they already understood what mattered was not the outcome, but the process that led to it. And the distant ring confirmed what they had begun to expect. Another clean hit, another precise correction not guided by instruments but by awareness. And Vickers nodded once, a small movement, but loaded with acknowledgement, not just of the shot, but of the shift in his team, because this was no longer recovery. This was adaptation. And that mattered far more in the long run. Next shooter, he said, and the rotation moved forward, each Marine stepping into position with a different mindset than the one they had started the day with. And Carter stepped up, heart steady but alert, the rifle settling into his shoulder as he aligned himself with the target. And for a brief second, the old habits pulled at him. The instinct to trust the numbers, to follow the clean, predictable logic of the data. But he pushed past it, letting his eyes drift beyond the scope, into the space where the air moved unseen. And he saw it again, faint but real, the overlapping currents, the subtle hesitation in the heat, the way one layer slipped past another without merging, and his breath slowed, his focus narrowing not to a single point, but to a path, a curved, shifting path that existed only for a moment before changing again. And behind him, Boone's presence remained steady, not watching Carter, not judging, just there, as if the outcome did not need to be monitored, because the process was already in motion. And Carter made his adjustment, small, deliberate, trusting what he could not fully define. And as his finger settled on the trigger, he felt something unexpected, not pressure, not doubt, but clarity, a quiet certainty that came not from knowing the answer, but from understanding the question. And he squeezed, smooth and controlled, and the rifle responded, sending the round into that complex space they had struggled to understand all morning. And time stretched again, not with tension, but with anticipation grounded in awareness. And when the distant sound returned, sharp and unmistakable, Carter did not react outwardly, but inside, something settled into place, something that would not leave. Because this was no longer about hitting a target, it was about seeing the world differently. And as he lifted his head from the rifle, his eyes moved not to the scoreboard, not to the data, but to the air itself, because now he knew that was where the real answer had always been. The final sequence did not feel like an ending. It felt like a threshold, the kind that separates practice from understanding. And Captain Ryan Vickers stood just behind the line, arms relaxed at his sides now, no longer forcing authority into the moment, because it had already been replaced by something more durable, something earned in real time. And the range itself seemed to reflect that shift, the wind still moving, still layered and unpredictable, but no longer chaotic, no longer something to fight against. And Walter Boone stepped forward for the first time without hesitation, not crossing the firing line, but close enough that his presence could no longer be mistaken for background. And the Marines noticed it immediately, the subtle change in posture, the way attention shifted toward him without command, without instruction, because now they understood that what he carried was not opinion. It was experience shaped into instinct, and Vickers watched him carefully, not as a superior evaluating a subordinate, but as a professional recognizing another. And there was no challenge left in his gaze, only focus. "Your turn," Vickers said quietly. And the words carried no sarcasm, no test, just an acknowledgement of what had already been proven. And Boone paused for a moment, looking down at the rifle resting on the line, modern, precise, engineered for perfection. And then he shook his head slightly, almost to himself, before setting the broom aside with a soft, deliberate motion. And he did not reach for the rifle immediately. Instead, he stepped forward into the open space between the line and the observers, his eyes moving not to the weapon, but to the range, to the air, to the shifting layers that had defined the entire day. And he stood there, still, silent, as if listening to something far beyond the reach of any instrument. And Carter felt it again, that quiet tension, not from uncertainty, but from anticipation, because this moment was different. This was not instruction, this was demonstration. And Boone finally moved, lowering himself behind the rifle with a familiarity that did not come from recent training, but from something older, something ingrained. And his hands settled into position without adjustment, without hesitation, as if the rifle was simply an extension of what he already understood. And he did not look through the scope right away. Instead, he lifted his gaze slightly, watching the heat rise, tracking the subtle distortions as they shifted across distance. And seconds passed, longer than any shooter had taken all day. But no one spoke, because they knew now that this waiting was not delay. It was precision. It was timing aligned with something they had only begun to understand. And Vickers felt it too. The restraint, the discipline to allow the moment to form before acting. And then Boone leaned in, at a scope, breath steady, not controlled, but synchronized with the environment around him. And for a brief instant, everything seemed to align, not perfectly, not statically, but dynamically. A moving balance that existed only in that exact second. And his finger tightened. Smooth, deliberate, and the rifle responded, sending the round forward into that layered space with a certainty that did not need to be proven. And no one tracked it this time. No one strained to see, because they already understood what was coming. And when the sound returned, sharp and unmistakable, it did not create surprise. It confirmed something deeper, something that had been building since the first moment he spoke. And Boone lifted his head slowly, not looking at the target, not seeking validation, just returning to stillness, as if the outcome had never been in doubt. And behind him, the wind shifted again, subtle, complex, alive, but no longer invisible, not to them, not anymore. And Vickers took a single step forward, his posture straight, his expression composed, but his voice, when it came, carried something new, something quieter, heavier. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, not because he expected a detailed answer, but because the question itself mattered. And Boone glanced at him briefly, the same calm in his eyes, the same depth that had been there from the beginning. And he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Out there," he said. And the words were simple, but they carried a lifetime behind them. And for the first time that day, no one tried to interpret them, because they did not need to. They understood enough already, and the rest would stay where it belonged. The range did not erupt into applause. It did not break into noise or celebration. Instead, it settled into something far more powerful, a silence that carried understanding. And Captain Ryan Vickers stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that anything spoken too quickly would diminish what had just taken place. And the wind moved again across the open ground, shifting the flags in uneven directions, the same layered currents that had frustrated them all morning, still present, still complex, but no longer misunderstood. And behind him, the Marines remained at their positions, not relaxed, not dismissed, but changed, their posture quieter, their focus deeper, as if something fundamental had been recalibrated inside them. And Corporal Liam Carter lowered his rifle slowly, his eyes drifting once more to the space between the line and the target, not searching for confirmation anymore, but acknowledging it. Because now he knew that the real work had never been about pulling a trigger, it had been about seeing what others overlooked. And Walter Boone stepped back from the rifle, his movements unhurried, unremarkable, as if he had simply completed a task no different from sweeping the dust moments earlier. And he reached for the broom again, fingers closing around the worn handle with the same ease he had shown behind the rifle. And that contrast settled heavily across the range, because it made what he had done feel even larger, not smaller. And Vickers watched him for a long second, the weight of command still present in his stance, but no longer rigid, no longer defensive. And he took a step forward, boots pressing lightly into the gravel, the sound deliberate, measured. And when he spoke, his voice carried none of the sharpness from earlier, only clarity. "We are done here," he said, not as a dismissal but as a conclusion. And the Marines did not move immediately, because they understood that this moment was not ending with a command. It was ending with recognition, and one by one, they stood, not hurried, not casual, but deliberate, each of them casting a brief glance toward Boone, not in curiosity, not in disbelief, but in respect, quiet and unspoken. And Carter was the last to turn, his gaze lingering for just a second longer, committing the image to memory, the old man with the broom, standing in the same place he had been at the start of the day, unchanged in appearance, but now impossible to overlook. And Vickers closed the distance fully this time, stopping just a few feet away, not intruding, but no longer distant. And he gave a single, precise nod, the kind reserved for equals, not subordinates. "Thank you," he said, the words simple, direct, carrying more weight than any formal acknowledgement could. And Boone looked at him briefly, that same calm expression, that same steady gaze. And he returned the nod just as simply. No pride, no need for recognition, only acknowledgement of what had already been understood. And then he turned slightly, the broom moving again across the ground with that soft, steady rhythm, as if the moment had passed, and there was nothing more to hold on to. And the Marines began to disperse, their voices low, their movements controlled, each of them carrying something invisible with them as they left the line, something that would not show up in reports or data, but would remain long after the day was done. And Vickers remained where he was for a moment longer, watching the range, the wind, the shifting air that no longer felt like an obstacle, but like a language he had only just begun to learn. And he exhaled slowly, the tension that had defined the morning replaced by something quieter, something steadier. And as he finally turned to leave, his eyes passed once more over Boone, who did not look up, did not pause, simply continued his work. And in that quiet, unremarkable motion, the lesson settled fully into place, not spoken, not written, but understood, that respect is never demanded, it is revealed, in moments where skill speaks louder than rank, and in silence, where truth needs no explanation.